looking forward to this morning, where we are continuing our series on how not to read your Bible. Are you going to put it on for me? There we go. Because I dropped the clicker, so I couldn't click over to the book. And so it's about this book. If you haven't ever seen the book, if any of you want to take a look at the book, I've got it here. It's this book by Dan Kimball. And this book looks at a number of the things in the Bible that might seem crazy, that might seem a little irrational, but it takes an honest look at them and helps us understand that behind those things, there are actually very rational and reasonable explanations, and it helps us dig into those. And I firmly do believe that. I firmly believe that there are rational answers to parts of the Bible that might at first seem to be irrational. We had a great talk last week from Pastor Dorian on misogyny, and is the Bible misogynistic, and talked about that, which I thought was great. Of course, he delivers it with a much better accent than I have, a much cooler accent. I was born and raised in Oklahoma, so I could shift into my Oklahoma accent, but no one has ever called that cool whenever I did that, so I don't have any plans to do that. But I also believe that we shouldn't be afraid to look at those parts of the Bible, those parts of the Bible that might make us feel a little uncomfortable, because I think there are good reasons for them, even here in the 21st century. But before we talk about the 21st century, I actually want to roll the clock back a little bit. I want to roll the clock back to the 17th century. All right, 1632 in Italy. And it's the year that Galileo, and since we're a small group, we're going to make this a little bit more informal, a little bit more interactive than we might normally. So Galileo, what's Galileo famous for? Telescope. It's astronomy, right? He is a famous astronomer. And it was in 1632 that he published findings that were rather earth-shattering. He claimed that the Earth orbited the sun. That was what he claimed in 1632, which might not sound like much, but up until that time, for centuries, it had generally been accepted that the Earth sat stationary and that everything in the sky, including the sun, revolved around the Earth. The church shared that view. And they shared that view. There's a picture of Galileo, if you want to know, by the way. And so the church shared that view, and they looked at a number of verses from the Bible to support that. They looked at verses like Ecclesiastes 1:5, the sun rises and the sun sets and hurries back to where it rises, right? It's the sun that's moving. Psalm 93:1, the world is established firm and secure. Or 1 Chronicles 16:30, the world is firmly established, it cannot be moved. So that was 1632 when Galileo made his pronouncement. The following year, 1633, the church issued the following order to Galileo. And I'll read it to you kind of word for word here, what they said. It said, we pronounce, judge, and declare that you, the said Galileo, I don't know why I wrote it that way, have rendered yourself vehemently suspected by this holy office of heresy. That is, of having believed and held doctrine which is false and contrary to the holy and divine scriptures, that the sun is the center of the world and that it does not move from east to west, and that the earth does move and is not the center of the world. They viewed that as heretical, what Galileo had said. And just in case you're thinking, well, the Protestants sure wouldn't do that, about 100 years earlier than Galileo was the Polish astronomer Nicholas Copernicus, who at the time was not nearly as well known as Galileo, and he had put forward a theory, wasn't completely accurate, but it was kind of in the right direction. He put forth a series called the heliocentric theory, which he said the sun was the center of of the universe and everything revolved around the sun. So he didn't get it quite right. But in response to what he had written, none other than Martin Luther responded with, "This fool," Copernicus, "wishes to reverse the entire science of astronomy." I bet you didn't know that Luther was an astronomer, that he could make that claim, which he wasn't. And then referring to the story in Joshua 10, you might be familiar with this. If not, you might want to take a read of it later. Luther goes on to say that sacred scripture tells us that Joshua commanded the sun to stand still, not the earth. So again, you can check that one out if you want. But what those two stories are, and the one from Luther was in the 1500s, the one from Galileo's in the 1600s, those are early examples of the tension that has long existed between science and the Bible. Many people outside the church and inside the church struggle with things that seem to go completely against what science teaches us. And if we can't believe those parts of the Bible, why should we believe other parts of the Bible? That's how the question goes. And I think, personally, that's a really good question. That's a fair question for someone to ask. And some of you may be wrestling with that same question. In fact, it's one that I've wrestled with myself. And for those of you who, I got to remember to, there we go. That's actually a painting of the proclamation being given to Galileo. I got to remember to push my button. I'm not very good about that. Okay, so the question of science versus the Bible. And again, for those of you that don't know about my past, let me just share a little bit with you so you'll know where I'm coming from. Because to put it very bluntly, I am a nerd. And I don't want to throw her under the bus, but my wife Karen is a nerd as well. And if you want proof, so I don't know if you know where Karen and I met. We met freshman year of college in an advanced calculus class. I mean, you might be wondering, first of all, who takes advanced calculus? Let alone who would ever meet their spouse in an advanced calculus class. But that's where we met freshman year. And I went on and got a degree in math. Like, who does that? I have no idea. And Karen went on and got a degree in aeronautical engineering. In fact, yes, the person that spent about 9 years as the director of student ministry here at the church was, in fact, a rocket scientist. I love being able to say that yes, I'm married to a rocket scientist. She had no idea I was going to say any of that, and I am going to hear about it afterwards. But I say all this stuff just to emphasize that, I care about logic, I care about facts, I care about the scientific method. And I've dug into questions about science and the Bible, and I believe wholeheartedly that the two can exist side by side. So this morning, I want to start by speaking to people who might be a bit skeptical about the Bible because it seems to support some things that might be counter to science. And when we think about areas where science and the Bible might be at odds, there are quite a few things that might come to mind for you. Things like Noah's Ark, or the Bible talks about people who've lived to be hundreds and hundreds of years old. And we're not going to have time to look at all those, and that's okay. What I want to do is share some principles that would be helpful in just about any of those situations. And so to illustrate it, I picked one of the big ones for us to start with, creation. We're going to start with that. And I know that most of you are familiar with the story of creation that's in Genesis 1, but we're going to take a fresh look at it. And I think you might just learn a little something new in the process, because I certainly did. But before we dive into the passage, let me remind you about the 4 important truths about reading the Bible that we learned at the beginning of this series. Those 4 are: the Bible is a library, not a book. The Bible was written for us, but not to us. never read a Bible verse, and all the Bible points to Jesus. Now, each week we've been unpacking kind of different aspects of those truths. And this morning, we are really going to unpack that second truth, that the Bible was written for us, but not to us. And you will see that it's really important to keep this in mind for what we're going to be looking at this morning. And let's start by first explaining what this statement really means. The Bible was written for us, not to us. The first part of that statement, that the Bible was written for us, means that there are eternal truths in the Bible that apply to us today just as much as they applied to the person that heard them thousands of years ago when it was first written. They are timeless, like truths about God's character and who He is. And the second part of that statement, that the Bible was not written to us, well, that means that the original audience of the Bible was not 21st century New Englanders. It was largely written for an Eastern Hebrew culture that lived thousands of years ago. And you might be saying, of course, I get that. The Bible was written a long time ago. And it was written to people who lived in the Middle East, not that live here. Well, what you might not fully appreciate is just how different that culture was and how different their circumstances were from our own. It's easy to think that the different parts of the Bible were written to were kind of maybe like the Amish, that they lived without our modern conveniences, but they generally tended to look at the world the same way that we do. But the reality is that nothing actually could be further from the truth. There are some really fundamental differences between our culture today and the culture of the people that lived when the Bible was originally written. And it's important to consider those differences when we look at the Bible. And let me give you some examples. So to start with, and here, we'll make this a little interactive, as I said again, instead of me just showing them up on the slide. To help me get started, what are some words that first come to your mind when I say to describe to me some of the attributes of God? What are some words that come up? Holy. Good. Did I hear someone say good? What else comes up? What was that? Mighty. Anything else? What's that? Loving. Those are all very good, very correct. Nothing wrong with those. In our Western culture, and Andrew's smiling because he knows where I'm going with this, because he knows a lot of this that we'll be talking about. In our culture, we tend to describe God using words that have very specific meanings, right? We like things in lists with bullet points, and we like things in prose. We use words when asked to describe, let's say, God. We'll use words like loving, merciful, omnipotent to describe God. They convey a lot of meaning, and there's nothing wrong with them. They mean a lot to us. They're very helpful. Right? You didn't say all those words, but you said some of them. Right? In an Eastern Hebrew culture, if you ask that same question, they're not going to give you answers like that. They're going to give you answers like, God is a fortress. God is like eagle's wings. God is a shepherd. Those are good answers too. But those are answers that are packed with meaning that we could talk about for a long time. They're pictures, but they don't have a real precise definition like the answers we would give. They're not more right or more wrong than ours, but they're different. And it's important that we understand that that's how that culture is going to think about questions like that. And it's going to be very different than how we think about it. Again, not better or worse, not right or wrong, but different. That Hebrew Eastern culture, they also prefer poetry and imagery and symbolism over lists and bullet points and prose. And that's important to keep in mind. Our words also, they tend to focus on the nature of God, while the Hebrews' words focus on the nature of the relationship that we would have with God. We want to know answers to who and what whenever something comes up. The Hebrew wants to know the answers of how. How is God relating to us in this situation? Not just all the facts of what took place in those interactions. And this is going to be really important, as I said, to remember as we look at the creation narrative in Genesis. There are a lot of other ways that our Western culture, and I'm kind of overgeneralizing when I say our Western, because that's the culture that many of us kind of grew up in and are familiar with, but not all of us, so I'm not trying to overly generalize, but kind of the Western culture and the difference, there's a lot of differences between that culture and the Eastern Hebrew culture. And we don't have time to get into all of them, but a couple of resources that I would share. One is a podcast that a lot of you are familiar with called Bema, which does a really good job of drawing that distinction between the Hebrew Eastern culture and the Western culture in going through aspects of the Bible. There's this book, as I said, How Not to Read the Bible. There's a number of good books and resources out there that talk about how to read the Bible through the eyes of the Eastern Hebrew culture and not just through our own lens. So there's a lot of good resources out there that really help to dig into it even more. So, to set that stage, let's now look at the creation narrative in Genesis 1. Not to be confused with the second creation narrative that's listed in Genesis 2. That raises other questions that we're not going to get into today, but there's a lot to dig into. So we're going to look at the first chapter of Genesis. And it's a little long, and I'm actually going to read the entire first chapter of Genesis. I'm going to read it in the NIV. If you want to follow along, you're welcome to. If you want to just sit back and listen, I'd encourage you to do that too. If you want to take a note or two about something that might have stood out to you as you hear it, because for some of you it may be the first time that you actually have heard the entire narrative all at one time. You're probably familiar with it, but we're going to go through the whole one. Okay, so are you ready? All right. Genesis chapter 1 in the NIV. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Now the earth was formless and empty. Darkness was over the surface of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the waters. And God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. God saw that the light was good, and he separated the light from the darkness. God called the light day, and the darkness he called night. And there was evening, and there was morning, the first day. And God said, "Let there be a vault between the waters to separate water from water." So God made the vault and separated the water under the vault from the water above it. And it was so. God called the vault sky. And there was evening and there was morning, the second day. And God said, "Let the water under the sky be gathered to one place, and let dry ground appear." And it was so. God called the dry ground land, and the gathered waters he called seas. And God saw that it was good. Then God said, "Let the land produce vegetation, seed-bearing plants and trees on the land that bear fruit with seed in it, according to their various kinds." And it was so. The land produced vegetation, plants bearing seed according to their kinds, and trees bearing fruit with seed in it according to their kinds. And God saw that it was good. And there was evening and there was morning, the third day. And God said, "Let there be lights in the vaults of the sky to separate the day from the night, and let them serve as signs to mark sacred times and days and years, and let them be lights in the vault of the sky to give light on the earth." And it was so. God made two great lights, the greater light to govern the day and the lesser light to govern the night. He also made the stars. God set them in the vault of the sky to give light on the earth, to govern the day and the night, and to separate light from darkness. And God saw that it was good. And there was evening and there was morning, the fourth day. And God said, oh, I had these great pictures to go along. So that was the fourth day. Sorry for that interruption. Again, I should have turned this all over to Cliff to clicking for me. And God said, let the water teem with living creatures, and let birds fly above the earth across the vault of the sky. So God created the great creatures of the sea and every living thing with which the water teems and that moves about in it according to their kinds, and every winged bird according to its kind. And God saw that it was good. God blessed them and said, be fruitful and increase in number and fill with water in the seas, and let the birds increase on the earth. And there was evening and there was morning, the fifth day. And God said, let the land produce living creatures according to their kinds, the livestock, the creatures that move along the ground, and the wild animals, each according to its kind. And it was so. God made the wild animals according to their kinds, the livestock according to their kinds, and all the creatures that move along the ground according to their kinds. And God saw that it was good. Then God said, let us make mankind in our image, in our likeness, so that they may rule over the fish in the sea and the birds in the sky, over the livestock and all the wild animals, and over all the creatures that move along the ground. So God created mankind in his own image. In the image of God, he created them. Male and female, he created them. God blessed them and said to them, be fruitful and increase in number. Fill the earth and subdue it. Rule over the fish in the sea and the birds in the sky and over every living creature that moves on the ground. Then God said, I give you every seed-bearing plant on the face of the whole earth and every tree that has fruit with seed in it. They will be yours for food, and to all the beasts of the earth and the birds in the sky and all the creatures that move along the ground, everything that has breath of life in it, I give every green plant for food. And it was so. God saw all that he had made, and it was very good. And there was evening and there was morning, the sixth day. And the heavens and the earth were completed in all their vast array. By the seventh day, and then we go into actually chapter 2 of Genesis just a little bit. By the seventh day, God had finished the work he had been doing. So on the seventh day, he rested from all his work. Then God blessed the seventh day and made it holy, because on it he rested from all the work of creating that he had done. Whew. We got through it. Genesis 1 and a couple of verses of Genesis 2. Now, when some of you read that or hear that, your reaction might be, well, it's pretty clear. It says everything was created in 6 days. So, if you believe God and the Bible, then that's what you should believe. There might be questions about dinosaurs and fossils, but God's bigger than that. He's way bigger than those things. Some of you read that or hear that, and your reaction is, no way. No way. This, as at best, a story that ancient people used to describe something that they couldn't understand because it goes against everything that science tells us. And, if the purpose of this passage is to provide a scientific explanation of creation, then there are some real problems in what we just read. We have to be honest. For example, plants were created on day 3. The sun is created on day 4. You can't have plants without the sun. So how does that work? And by the way, ever since people have been around, we measure days by the sun, the movement of the sun, or our movement relative to the sun. But the sun wasn't created until day 4, so what really was going on days 1, 2, and 3 when it said days? How do you measure days when there's no sun? Well, believe it or not, what I want to do this morning in the time we've got left is to try to reconcile both of those views. Because I believe that we don't have to choose between science and the Bible. You see, the reality is that this passage is not a science textbook. And it wasn't written to describe how the universe was created. When we read it with our Western eyes, we assume that because that's how we read passages like that, right? We want to know how. So we look for it to answer those how questions. Those are the natural questions for us to ask when we read that passage. So what was that passage trying to communicate then, if it wasn't trying to communicate the creation story? Well, first, let's ask this question. If it's not a science textbook, then what is it? What genre is it? Well, it had these interesting refrains in it that you might have noticed. It said, there was evening and there was morning the first day. There was evening and there was morning the second day, the third day, the fourth day. It repeated that refrain over and over. And it also repeated this refrain, and God saw that it was good. And when you see literature that repeats refrains like that over and over, what does it sound like to you? Poetry. And it's pretty generally recognized by Bible scholars that that's what that was. What I read to you was a poem, an ancient poem that had stanzas that it went through day by day. And it's not just any poem. It's a poetic form that's referred to as a chiasm, or also known as a chiasmus. And that type of poem would have been readily recognized by the people that it was written to thousands of years ago in that Eastern Hebrew culture. And those people knew that a chiasm has an internal structure that points to an overall point of emphasis that the poem is trying to emphasize. And what is that point of emphasis? Well, unfortunately, I don't have time to go through all the detail that goes into a chiasm. But it's really actually quite fascinating about how it all comes together. And so even though this passage isn't a science textbook, it is actually a very complex piece of literature. And that book, How Not to Read the Bible, or the faithma podcast, those resources do a great job of going into a lot of the detail about what a chiasm is and how it all comes together and what it points to. So we're not going to have time to go through that, but I don't want to leave you completely hanging about what it could be pointing to. And so to understand what that point of emphasis might have been, let's think a little bit more about who this was being written to. Right, so again, we'll make this now a little bit more interactive than me just kind of reading it here. And I got to catch up again with my, okay. So who is generally recognized to be the author of the book of Genesis? Moses. Moses would generally, okay. And where in the history of the Hebrew people were we when Moses wrote this? Anyone to know where they were? They were in the desert. They were wandering in the desert. So they hadn't crossed into the promised land yet, but they had left their enslavement by the Egyptians. So they're wandering in the desert. They had been slaves in Egypt for 400 years. And now they were free from that, but not in the promised land yet. And what had they been doing while they were in Egypt? They were slaves. And what was one of the main things that they did as slaves? They made bricks. That was the life of a slave, making bricks. Think they were 9 to 5, Monday through Friday? Probably not. Probably sun up to sundown, 7 days a week. That was their life as slaves. And they had spent 400 years doing that. And that was what they knew. And that was their sense of worth. If you wanted to have a sense of worth to the Egyptians, you made bricks. If you couldn't make the bricks, you weren't of any use to the Egyptians. That was what your life was. So now they're free from that, and God has a message that he wants to share. What does God want to share as a message to those people who are free from brick-making slavery for 400 years? And I would say that before anything else, he wanted them to know that they are his treasured masterpiece, just as they are. And again, we can't go into all the detail of this poem and how does it point to some of these things. But a couple things we can take just at the surface. Remember that each day of the creation story ends with God saying that his creation was good. He did this, it was good, it was good. But on day 6, the pattern was broken. On day 6, God says the creation of male and female, in this creation story, right, he talks about male and female. We don't have the story of the rib and Adam and Eve yet. This is just the created male and female, and that creation was very good. From the time they were created, they were very good. They didn't have to make bricks. They didn't have to do anything else to be accepted or treasured by God. Just by having been created, they were very good. The second thing that God wanted them to know was that it was okay to rest. On day 7, it says that God rested. Now, obviously, God didn't rest because he was tired. Another way to think of the idea of resting is that it describes here completeness. He rested because he was done. Think of Michelangelo carving the David statue, right? At some point, the statue is done, and there's no more stone to remove away. And if you keep removing stone away, you're going to ruin the statue. At some point, it's done. And this idea and when Michelangelo got to that point where he said, I've taken all the stone off that I can, he rested because he was done. And that's the image of God resting here. He rested because he was done with his creation. He had done all that he was going to do, and it was very good. By saying that God rested on the seventh day, it further emphasized that the people he created, male and female, were a completed masterpiece as part of creation. It also communicated to them that it was okay to rest. Remember, every day in the creation narrative ended with the phrase, it was evening and it was morning the first day. It was evening and it was morning the second day. There was evening and there was morning the seventh day. It doesn't have that phrase at the end. It's like it leaves day 7 open, which is God inviting us into this same idea of rest with the completeness of creation. It's also unique that it talks about it was evening and it was morning. We think of the day of being, it was morning and it was evening. But this says it was evening and it was morning. Because the Hebrew day starts at sundown, not at sunrise. And what's really awesome about that is that means that the Hebrew day doesn't start with working and what am I going to do today. The Hebrew day starts with, I'm going to rest. That's how you start your day. You start your day by resting, and then you get into work the next morning. Really powerful. So the seventh day doesn't end with that same formula. It leaves it open. It's part of that reminder that it's okay to rest, that we're invited to join God in recognizing that we're good enough just as we're created. It doesn't mean that we don't live in a messed up world, and it doesn't mean that we're not messed up people, but that comes in Genesis 3, right? The underlying truth that God wanted to communicate, first thing that he wanted to make sure, those people free from 400 years of slavery, was that they are part of God's very good creation, just as they are. Now, you might be wondering, how am I supposed to get all of that? from reading that passage today in English. And my answer is that you're not supposed to get that. But a Hebrew, listening to this 3,500 years ago, when this was written, it would be very familiar to them. And that is why it's so important to read and understand these passages from the point of view of the people that they were written for. Remember, the Bible was written for us, but not to us. So how is this passage then written to us today? Because we're not in similar circumstances to them, are we? I would argue that this message is just as important to us today as it was for them. We live in a culture that measures success, maybe not by how many bricks we make, but it certainly measures success by how much we produce, how busy we can stay. And I think it's just as important for us to be reminded that we are each a masterpiece created by God just as we are, not because of what we produce or how busy we stay. Working harder or producing more isn't what makes us valued to God. Because God created us, we are valued. And it's okay to rest. In fact, God wants us to rest. It's how we're made. It's part of the reason that day 7 in the story doesn't have a closing phrase. Okay, I know we're getting about out of time here. And my real purpose this morning, right, was not to do a detailed study of Genesis 1, right? That really wasn't the point. The purpose is to point out that many times what seems to be a conflict between science and the Bible, remember that's really what this was about. It's really a misinterpretation that comes from looking at a passage through our modern Western eyes instead of through the eyes of the people that the passage was written to. If we work to draw out the original meaning and intent of a passage, instead of reading it in our own interpretation, you're going to find that most of what you initially thought were inconsistencies or irregularities are really misunderstandings that we have read into a passage. I also want to point out that this is not looking at the Bible as any less important or authoritative. Instead, I think it's just the opposite. Recognizing the Bible has an incredibly important message from God that we desperately need to hear, and it helps us to pull out what that is. But sometimes pulling that out and understanding those messages takes work. Not because the messages are in some mystical code that only some guru can decipher for us. We just have to remember that reading the Bible through the eyes of people that lived thousands of years ago can take some patience and some effort, but doing so will give you much more confidence in what you're reading and make what seems like something that's maybe confusing or irrelevant come alive, like it never may have before. And if you're someone that thought the Bible didn't have anything to say to us today because it's full of scientific inaccuracies or things that just seem to be completely irrelevant, I hope that this morning helped spark an interest in you that there might be a little more to it than you might have thought after all. So, I hope that helped you gain a little bit, maybe new insight into that creation story and into some ways to approach the Bible when we encounter things that seem to be just not making complete sense to us. It's okay to ask those questions and dig into them. So God bless and have a great week.